Welcome back. We're talking about executive compensation, um, and asking the question, is it immoral to pay CEOs and other executives of large corporations the huge salaries, in the millions, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars? Um, is there something wrong with that when it's so out of proportion of to the amount of money that, a normal employee of that same corporation would make? So here, Boatwright is going to argue that no, it's not immoral to pay a CEO a huge salary, um, although he does allow for one possible exception to that. So you've probably heard of, or you've experienced maybe even the outrage when people hear the sorts of salaries that the heads of companies are making. They can be in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars a year. You can think, it's outrageous. I only make whatever you make, what is the minimum wage? $15 an hour. And these folks are making, $1 million a day. You know what I mean? Um, so people can say it's too much, right? It's out of proportion. The inequality is too extreme. It seems offensive and it seems immoral. But that's just a gut reaction. That's just an intuition. There's been less articulation or argument about what exactly is wrong with a CEO being paid that much. So Boatwright wants to, start to analyze, what the possible arguments could be on either side. But he has to flag a big thing at the beginning, which is uh, we exist within an economic system, right? We happen to exist in a capitalist system. Um, in other countries, you're in a communist system, in a fascist system, and so he doesn't want to write a book about which economic system is the right one. Right? He's not going to argue that capitalism is good and communism is bad or the other way around. You can't do that in an article. It's too big a question. So he's going to set, guardrails, boundaries, which is a good thing for you to do in your essay too, to avoid sort of moving beyond your scope too much. You can say, look, I'm just going to assume that the system we're in is fine, that there's nothing deeply immoral about our current capitalist system in the US, right? Um, maybe I'm wrong about that, but I can't answer that question right now, right? So assuming that there's nothing deeply immoral about the system, he says, then we can ask, within that system, is there anything immoral about paying CEOs that much? Because, as we'll note, this is a relatively recent development. As recently as the 80s, CEOs were not getting paid in the tens of millions of dollars. This is only a recent thing. So even within our system, we've gone through periods where CEOs didn't get paid this much. So it is conceivable that it could turn out to be what we're doing now turn out to be an aberration and something wrong that needs to be corrected. So in this case, so this is what I've just said, right? He's going to, assume certain boundaries to look at our system, right? Um, and he's going to argue that at least in a system like ours, in a capitalist society, uh, if a CEO receives a huge salary as a result of fair bargaining, then it's perfectly ethical, right? Um, but he will, once he gets into the details of how CEOs are paid, he will note that there are situations in our system where that bargaining isn't perfectly fair. And so that could be a problem. Right? Um, and in particular, if that system of bargaining of how the CEO's, salaries are determined, if that creates bad consequences and sort of a consequentialist utilitarian argument, that could be an argument against high CEO pay in specific circumstances. Okay, so how does how do CEO salaries get determined? Right? It typically goes like this, right? There's a compensation committee, and it's made up of maybe 3 or 4 members of the board of the directors. So the board of directors is a group of people that run a company. So, a large publicly held company, um, like AT&T or something, you might own stock in it, right? So there's a lot of stockholders, and each of those stockholders is a part owner of the company. But, just because I own AT&T stock doesn't mean that I have any involvement really in how the company is run, right? The company is run by the board of directors. They're the ones that make these big decisions. One of them being hiring the CEO, who's going to do all more of the day-to-day running of the company. So it's members of the board of directors decide what to pay the CEO, right? And they might consult with, there are compensation consultants that will, let them know what they think that the right salary to be paid is. So they may talk to them. Um, but typically they're not doing a lot of ethical research or anything like that on CEO compensation. Right? So they'll agree on a package, and the CEO will accept it and take the job or not. The package will consist of several parts. So there is just a base salary, like maybe like what I get, um, but there will also be bonuses often that are tied to performance. So if you meet certain benchmarks, as we'll see, typically those have to do with stock price going up, right? And if that happens, then the CEO gets a bonus, gets paid more. They'll also have grants of stock in the company or options to buy stock in the company, and other sort of long-term incentive plans. So it's uh, a package of a variety of ways of getting paid, and some of them are not guaranteed, right? Some of them are only if performance is good, and other parts of the package will include the types of benefits that you or I might get, like a retirement plan. They can get signing bonuses, which are sometimes called golden handshakes because they can be quite large, these signing bonuses. Uh, if you get fired early, you can get a severance package, what they call a golden parachute that can also be fairly large. So there's lots of parts of the pay package of the salary. It's not just the base salary. So the reason that the base salary is not the only part, or one of the main reasons, and in fact often the smallest part, is because of the way the tax code works. So base pay the salary rarely exceeds $1 million because in 1993 they changed the tax code so that any salary over $1 million, there's certain limits on the deductions you can take, unless the salary is tied to the performance of the company. So the bulk of the compensation tends to come in bonuses that are, contingent on meeting certain benchmarks, like again, stock price hitting a certain number, or it'll come in the form of stock options, which is uh, an opportunity to buy stock in the company at a certain price, and that's a good deal, if it's a relatively low price and the stock price goes up, which is of course the CEO's job to do. Right? So the stock options actually end up being the bulk of the executive's compensation package because it's not taxable income exactly. It's just a chance, right, to buy what will hopefully be a valuable asset at a cut rate, right? Um, but it is only a benefit to the executive if the stock price does go up, right? If the stock price plummets because the CEO does a bad job, and the stock options are pretty worthless to that CEO, right? So it serves as an incentive for the CEO to do a good job and have the stock go up because then their options will be worth a lot of money. Now, of course, we've seen people who've argued that this narrow focus on stock price is not actually a good thing, right? Stout has argued that there are lots of other important values that are left out of, even at odds with stock price, but this tends to be the focus in CEO pay in this current era. So, since the 90s, and partly because of the way the tax code changed, but lots of other economic factors that Boatwright gets into, that I think I will have the time to get into in detail. CEO pay has exploded since the 90s, right? So in the 80s, it was pretty rare for an executive to make more than $1 million a year. Um, Now the average is in the tens of millions. This paper and the other paper we're reading, written early 2000s, and they're citing around an average of 8 million. It's certainly gone up since then, right? So definitely 10 million. Um, so since, the salaries are mostly in the form of stock options, which only count as payment or as a good deal if the stock price goes up, you got a lot of focus on what the duty of the executive is to the company, which is, not so much satisfying customers, employees, right, lenders. It's satisfying the stockholders and making sure that stock price goes up. And this is what Boatwright calls the CEO's entrepreneur model. So the idea is to um, take a company and increase its value as much as possible. So Boatwright notes a bunch of objections to high executive pay. Some of them he notes also some potential responses, right? So we'll go through these objections, and then he'll get into his argument that uh, executive pay is by and large perfectly moral, right? Even when it's high. So um, the first argument is so much an argument as, again, the intuitive reaction that we described, which was particularly in the first year when they get, when they're being paid to sign on in the beginning, uh, CEOs get these huge checks that, you know, uh, hundreds of millions, right, in the first year, which just seems to us like, how could any person deserve that? How could that ever be right? Especially when I'm only making whatever I'm making, right? It seems obscene, right? Um, so as we've noted, an intuition is not an argument yet. We need an argument, but also, that is just the first year, and it's kind of rare that it's that big of a number. There's CEOs and there's CEOs. Like some of them are very well known and get huge amounts of money. Others get more average or below average, you know, packages. Um, typical CEO will be paid a few million a year, which amounts to about 8% of the corporate earnings. So maybe that doesn't seem like, a huge percentage of the overall value that they contribute. Another objection to high executive pay. Um, Sometimes, I mean, you hear of this, right? That they hire a CEO, the company crashes and burns, and the CEO leaves with their golden parachute, still making millions of dollars, while the stockholders lose, their pensions, right? And this seems to people clearly wrong. Like, why should this person be profiting and doing so well if they've crashed the company? Um, but Boatwright points out that just because the company crashes while someone's in charge doesn't mean that they crashed the company necessarily. A lot of the time, there's mergers, there's acquisitions, it's beyond the CEO's control. Sometimes the company just gets bought out, the CEO gets fired, and so they get their nice severance package, and the whole thing was beyond their control. Right? So um, it's not always the case that just because the executive does well while the company does poorly, it may not even be their fault. Um, Sometimes it's not just the sheer number of the salary that CEO is getting paid, but the ratio between executive pay and the pay of a regular employee. A CEO makes 300 to 400 times the salary of an average worker. Something about that seems, immoral. Um, and if you follow that to its logical conclusion, it means that, because, as we said in the 80s, CEOs weren't typically ever making more than $1 million. CEO pay has been increasing very rapidly, while um, pay for regular workers has only been creeping up much more slowly. So the difference in that acceleration also seems somehow unfair, right? Um, Number five, well, so if we've got all this focus on the stock price, and that's why supposedly CEO salaries are so high, right, because of these options and stuff, surely there's a way to do that more cheaply, right? So sure, even if the CEO is talented and works hard and does a good job increasing the stock price, um, do they need to be paid tens of millions of dollars to do this? Lots of people, I would be happy to work very hard for a few 100,000 a year, right? Um, and I'll certainly do my best all day long. Um, who could possibly need, tens or hundreds of millions, no matter how hard they work and how much good they do for the company, right? It just seems like an obscene number that it could never, no one could ever spend that much money even if they tried, right? So number six, again, these are more objections to this high executive pay. Um, and we heard a similar thing from Stout, this focus on increasing stock price, typically in the short term, they're trying to hit their benchmarks, which tend to be, within like quarters and years, not like decades. Um, they you can sometimes, use strategies that pump up stock price in the near term, sacrifice long-term growth, and that's a worry as well. Number seven, so the way board of directors is chosen, they're not voted on by the stockholders typically, right? And again, board of directors are the people that hire the CEO. It's actually the CEO who hires or nominates members to the board of directors. These nominations almost always go through, and basically it boils down to, in a typical case, the CEO handpicks the members of the board. And these are the people that are deciding the CEO's salary if his contract comes up for negotiation or her contract. Um, these members of the board are often CEOs themselves of other companies. They tend to um, take on this job. It's a relatively easy job. They work maybe 20 days a year. They get paid in the six figures to be on the board of another company. Um, but all these CEOs, they're buddies with each other. They all have an interest in keeping CEO pay high. And so it doesn't seem like what we'll see in both of these articles we'll be reading. Uh, this doesn't look like, quote, arm's length negotiation. This looks like self-dealing, like insider stuff, right? So that seems like a problem as well. And number eight, tying CEO pay to increases in stock price is not a perfect measure of the CEO's performance because there can just be economic factors, right? There's just a booming economy and everybody does well, and your stock price goes up, and it could have nothing to do with what the CEO did, right? But they still get paid. So the way these deals are structured seems like an imperfect way of measuring and rewarding CEO performance. So these are some of the objections. Um, Boatwright doesn't address all of these directly, right? He sort of notes these and then makes a more general argument um, that whatever a CEO ends up getting paid will typically be moral, right? And that argument looks like this. Think back to our discussion of Robert Nozick, right? And his idea of distributive justice. It says, look, um, if someone agrees to pay you to do a job and you sign a contract and you say, okay, I'll pay you $30 million to run this company, and you say, okay, I'll take your $30 million, that money got transferred fair and square, right? Nobody stole from anybody, nobody drugged anybody or deceived anybody. It was a just transfer, and so you're justified in what you get, right? That is sort of a basic kind of capitalist assumption. It's Nozick's assumption, or his, at least he argues for that um, approach to transfers of goods, right? So as long as both the CEO and the board are entering into this deal voluntarily, okay, well, it happened fair and square. What could be wrong with that? That's just capitalism. So that's his, main argument, and it's a convincing one, again, within the bounds of a capitalist system. Not everyone accepts this principle. There are other approaches to what is the right way to justify CEO pay. So other people argue, no, what justifies, a high salary or a lower salary is the CEO's contribution to the firm's overall production, right? So if the CEO, if a janitor is adding some amount of value to the company, then they should get paid that value they're adding. And if a CEO adds a ton of value to a company, then they should be getting paid for that value, right? Um, and so this doesn't automatically, however, mean that a CEO shouldn't be getting paid a huge amount of money if they're adding a huge amount of value to the company, right? And Boatwright argues this is in today's economy, this is exactly what we're hiring CEOs to do, right? Um, they're entrepreneurs, they're contributing something that other employees don't, because they're taking a company that's got certain inputs, suppliers, right? They're doing, they're creating their widgets, and the CEO, he or she envisions a new way to generate profit out of this structure, right? They're sort of like conceptual geniuses. So he calls this sort of greater profit out of an existing structure. He calls this pure profit, right? And it's the sort of magic that a great CEO can do to increase stock price. So, imagine like we know them throughout history, Henry Ford and Jeff Bezos and people like that, right? So Jeff Bezos, he figured out a new way to sell books, right, on the internet. And then he extended it to all these other sorts of products, right? And he created this new thing. I mean, before we had catalogs, it's not that people had never bought things over mail order before, but this was instant, right? Get shipped to your house. He manages to scale it up and get it to your house like within the next day, kind of thing. He invented this new thing that everybody loves and everybody uses all the time, right? So, yeah, he deserves a huge amount of money because he's a genius, right? That's the idea. uh, of this pure profit thing, right? So, and these things don't last that long, right? Sooner or later, somebody sees what you're doing and imitates it. Um, and so, while it lasts, you've got somebody just did a magic trick, right? They generated a huge amount of profit that no one had ever thought of doing before, and so they deserve to get paid a huge amount. So says Boatwright. Right? So, the idea is the price that a CEO should be paid depends on supply and demand in a free market. So, a good CEO is going to add value to the company. So the board of directors should definitely pay him a salary. That salary shouldn't exceed the value that the CEO is going to add, otherwise you're losing money on the deal. Um, and of course, the CEO is going to be looking to get the highest salary they can, um, so long as it's not, below the reserve price for which they're willing to work, which is just, a technical term for, you go looking for a job, you're not going to take a wage below a certain amount. You're hoping to get the highest amount you can get that is above that. And likewise, the board of directors is trying to get the CEO for the lowest price relative to the value they're going to add to the company. And if that negotiation results in salary of $30 million, then so be it, right? That's how the market works. Mm. But the CEO is not like a normal employee, right? So this kind of negotiation that I just described uh, applies to hiring any employee, right? Whether it's, again, a janitor, a factory line worker, or someone working in HR. They're going to contribute some value to the company, and you'd like to hire them for a price that's at least slightly lower than the value they add, right? Um, but the CEO is not a normal employee, um, and you can't quite calculate their salary based on like, okay, this person is going to produce, 3 cars a day, and we can sell those for $30,000 each, and so, this is how much we should pay them so that we make this much profit on each car or something like that. The CEO's job is somewhat more abstract. They just need to one way or another improve the value of the company, raise that stock price, right? Um, and they're hired because they're one of those sort of magic people that can do that. Not if somebody else could do it, they would have done it, right? Um, so it's hard to like supervise or guide the ex CEO or make sure they're punching in at the right time and stuff. Um, the only really way you can really direct them or constrain them or try to make sure they do their job is to give them incentives, and stock options are the incentive that we've decided to give these folks, right? To do this very abstract and difficult and sort of like magical job that they do. Right? Now, of course, one problem is, suppose the benchmarks are met. Was it the CEO? Did they do their job, their magic trick, or was it just happened to be the economy picked up? Um, you're also your pool of candidates is pretty small. Not a lot of people have that kind of mind, right? There's not a lot of Jeff Bezoses out there, but that's kind of what you're looking for. So you got a relatively small pool of people to draw from, and they're all expecting very high salaries. Um, and so, as often as not, right, you think you're hiring a genius, and they don't do it. They don't pull off the magic trick. They don't hit the benchmarks, right? Um, but that's part of, argues Boatwright, the advantage of the stock options, right? Well, if they pay them mostly in stock options, and they do what you were hoping they would do, which is raise the stock price, then they're not going to make any money on the deal either, or not as much as they would have, right? So Boatwright says the reason CEO pay is so high when it is high is because the person was very special. They really increased the value of the company, and they got paid accordingly, right? The stock option was the mechanism for determining how much they're worth. And when they failed, they don't get the big payday because the stocks didn't go up. But it sometimes happens that, the CEO ends up being paid more than the value they add to the company. And some people have argued that even this is okay. This can be moral. This is the called the principal agent approach. So the idea here is uh, you're not just when you hire a CEO, you're not just hiring somebody to do a job, right? Um, you're hiring someone to build your company, to develop it, to care about your company, to love your company and treat it as if it were their own, right? That's the only way that you can pull off, again, that what I'm describing is a magic trick of pulling pure profit out of thin air. They have to be obsessed with your company. Um, the CEO is an agent for your company. They're not an owner, right? They're not a stakeholder. Um, but the job is special because you need the CEO to act as though they're in love with the company and it's their whole life, right? They need to devote enormous time, energy, and loyalty. They're far beyond a normal employee, right? They put in a lot of hours and it's a stressful job, right? So the idea on this principal agent approach is you need to pay them more. You need to pay an agent to act like they are a principal, right? That they are a serious stakeholder in the company. They need to act like the company is their baby. So those are all, his arguments for why CEO pay can be very high, right? And it could still be morally justified. It considers one argument against this, which is this situation of how CEOs get paid, right? And the board of directors. So um, it has been argued that this bargaining process is not a fair one, right? As I pointed out earlier, um, the board of directors is not sort of directly um, hired by the stockholders. They are nominees. CEOs nominate the board of directors, and then in turn, the board of directors decides how much to offer the CEO in pay. And this seems like a little bit shady, right? Um, because a member of the board knows that the CEO is responsible for getting them a job. They're going to feel gratitude to that CEO. Um, they're not going to want to get kicked off the board of directors, right? Um, they might already know might already be buddies with the CEO. That's why they nominated them in the first place. And they're probably a CEO of a different company. So they have an interest again in keeping CEO pay up. So um, there's all these overlapping motivations to pay the CEO well. It may not serve the stockholders directly, right? Um, and the stockholders don't have enough control, and the board of directors aren't necessarily stockholders, so they don't even necessarily benefit if the company does well. They get paid either way. And the government, unless there's some egregious fraud or something, the government doesn't really intervene into this situation. So it seems like a breeding ground for, insider deals and a lack of arm's length bargaining, as they call it. So, this managerial power thesis about the way this is all, leads to hiring CEOs, paying them too much to the detriment of the company. This is all partly speculation, right? It's an empirical question whether this arrangement actually is bad for the company or whether it's good. But he says, let's suppose for now that it is true, right? Um, does that make it immoral, these executive pay packages, right? So he says, look, even if all these factors result in an executive getting paid too much relative to the value they add to the company, which happens, sometimes you hire a CEO, you're hoping they'll add a lot of value to the company, so you pay them a lot, and they end up not adding more value than you paid them, right? So you end up getting a raw deal. Um, that alone isn't immoral, right? People make bad deals, people screw up, hire somebody at too high a wage. It happens, right? Um, so he says there needs to be some sort of additional harm or some additional wrongness to make this situation actually immoral. Um, the sort of harm we're talking about is, if there is actual fraud, right? If there's some breach of the fiduciary duty between the board and the stockholders, or any other sort of overall social harms, if any of those followed from this system of deciding CEO pay, then there might be some case, but in some cases, CEO pay is immoral. So does this ever happen? I mean, sometimes it does, right? So yeah, CEOs commit fraud. They might manipulate stock prices, do insider trading, um, find ways to get themselves paid or their friends paid. Um, if, right, that was the result of some way of a lack of the arm's length negotiation and CEO pay, right? If it was the result of the situation of the board of directors, then yeah, that would be immoral. How frequent is that? Uh, Not super frequent. And when you're dealing with fraud, it's not so much the system that's the fault, argues Boatwright, but the the person committing the fraud, right? So yeah, if the CEO is ripping people off, that's a bad CEO. That's immoral. But it's not so much the fact that he got paid a lot. It's the fact that he's, a crook. He or she is a crook. Um, the issue of potential breach of fiduciary duty means this, right? So if the board pays too much to hire a CEO and they don't add that much value to the company, well, they've just, right, that's not good for the stockholders. But again, if they just made a mistake, that's not immoral, right? People screw up. Making money in business is hard. Um, you know, you make good deals, you make bad deals. So uh, if it's the result of them overestimating CEO's abilities or failing to forecast relevant market conditions, that's not going to be immoral. Um, it would have to be a form of fraud where they knew CEO wasn't any good and they hired him anyways because he was a buddy or because he was blackmailing or something, right? Um, but so according to Boatwright, the only condition where he thinks it could actually be a serious problem and make high CEO pay immoral is if somehow society would be better off if this hiring process and you know salary determining process was more transparent or could be were controlled better by the shareholders. Um, if that ended up, having general benefits, you know, better for the company, but also maybe better for all the other stakeholders, sorry, in the company, then you could see a utilitarian argument for having a different system for hiring and paying CEOs. So again, he says, he has lots of arguments, but right, that for the most part, there's nothing immoral about paying a CEO a huge amount, right? Hey, it's a free market. If these people make a deal, there's nothing wrong with it. Nobody got coerced, right, or forced into the deal, then it's perfectly moral. Also, CEOs add huge value to the company sometimes. They deserve to be paid a huge amount, right? Um, he says that really the only situation where it might be immoral is if, because he admits this, the way, it happens to be in our society, the way the CEOs are hired is a little funky with his board of directors. It's not really independent of the CEO. If that situation could be improved, then it should be changed, right? If that would create better results for everybody to hire CEOs in a different way, then sure, do that, right? And if that ends up in CEOs being paid a bit less, then okay, fine, right? But by and large, he doesn't see a serious problem. Right, I will see you next time with an article against high CEO pay.